Hello, my friends. Can you believe summer is already coming to a close? I don't know about you, but this has felt like one of the fastest summers yet. What began for me as a simple intention to slow down, restore, and focus on personal care quietly evolved into something much deeper. Something I never could have anticipated. Who would have thought that my journey toward self care would lead me to the world of witches and wizards? Yes, you heard that right. Following my curiosity, I set aside fear, released old assumptions, and opened myself to a realm that is often misunderstood. And in doing so, I discovered something profound. This summer wasn't just about skincare or rest. It became an invitation to understand healing, power, intuition, and ritual from a completely new perspective. And whether you've followed along out of interest, curiosity, or skepticism, I hope this journey has sparked something in you as well, even if it's simply the courage to question, explore, and seek truth for yourself. Today, we wrap up our summer series on personal care through the eyes of a modern witch, with a special conversation featuring our July author, Tenae Stewart, cottage witch, self-love coach, and the brilliant mind behind the Modern Witch's Guide to Magickal Self-Care. In this episode, we explore one of the more esoteric but foundational aspects of her book, Astrology, and how it serves not only as a tool for spiritual insight, but as a guide for creating a self care practice that's fully aligned with who you are. Get ready for a conversation that is equal parts empowering, enlightening, and mystically grounded. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, I invite you to listen with an open heart and a curious mind. Let's step into the magic together. Hello, Tenae. Welcome to Kinky Knots Cafe's Proactive is the Way. If you could, please provide us a nice overview of your personal and professional background.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. So I am an astrologer. I'm a cottage witch, and a spiritual coach, and I help people to live their most magical lives, really understand themselves and connect with their most authentic self, so they can have a spiritual practice that really works for them, but also just really live a magical life in all the different parts of their lives, not just their spirituality.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. Well, and you had mentioned that your background was astrology. And I will say, while we did read your book, and I shared with you earlier, we did an overview of the book a couple weeks ago, or sorry, no, just recently. And within your book, I was really engrossed within it. But the area that touched me the most was the astrology part. And so, first and foremost, just truly want to thank you for really coming on today and bringing us your level of insight, showing up and allowing us an opportunity to really have a better understanding as to astrology, what it is, etc. What I do appreciate, in addition to the astrological piece within your book, was the spirituality piece that you referenced. We'll hopefully get to talk a little bit more, but within this particular session, really want to focus on astrology and better understanding that. But from the spiritual component, really appreciated how you structured it in the sense that allowing your audience really to design a practice that works for them. Because so often you don't see that the openness to allow individuals to explore, to have a better understanding as to what works for them, what does not work for them. So really excited that I got to learn a little bit about how you recommended we approach that. So once again, today is going to be about the astrological piece. Um, you know, I had so many questions, a lot of questions, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to go through some of my most deep questions that I think my audience will truly appreciate. Okay.
Awesome.
All
Thanks for
right. So
having me.
yeah. So let me go ahead and I'll begin kind of with the first question. When I was thinking about how I wanted to structure this interview, I thought to myself, well, gosh, there's so much I want to know, and I only have an hour of her time. And so what I thought would be helpful for our audience is really to give an outline with regards to astrology, the where how it originated, the historical component of it, and the cultural piece of it. I think something that was just really interesting to me was the fact that there are many different types of or forms of astrology, such as Western, Vedic, I believe Mayan, Celtic, Chinese, Greek, Hellenistic, just to name a few, because there's probably more, but those are the primary ones that I noticed. And what I wanted to get a sense from you, because right, you're in this space, is do you find that these systems that exist are they complementary to one another, or do they serve a very distinct spiritual or cultural function?
Yeah, so the two main forms of astrology that most people work with, one of the two, is Western, which is really Hellenistic, and Vedic astrology. So Western, which Hellenistic at this point is sort of considered a branch of the larger umbrella of Western astrology, and yet also Western astrology comes from the Hellenistic tradition, but it's not the only way that we practice it now. So Western or primarily Greek, but also with a lot of Arabic influence as well, in the Western tradition, is the tradition that the vast majority of people that you follow on Instagram are probably using. It is the system that I use.
Okay.
And Western, also called tropical astrology. Western tropical astrology is based on the seasons. So whenever you hear, once or twice a year, every astrologer in the world gets inundated with messages of people freaking out that they read an article that their astrology sign is wrong. And that is because there is this very prolific article that goes around once or twice a year, that insists that there's a 13th zodiac sign and this and that and all of these things. And that is because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the two different forms of astrology, which is Western tropical astrology and Vedic sidereal astrology. And Vedic sidereal astrology still only has 12 zodiac signs, but it is based on, if you look up at the sky at night and you can see the physical constellations, that's what it's based on. It's based on what you visually see. Western tropical astrology, which, like I said, is what a lot of people online, a lot of people are using Vedic as well. But Western, I would say, I don't know the stats on this, but I would guess is probably the more common and is most likely the sign off the top of your head is your Western zodiac sign, is based on the seasons. So it's not actually physically based on what you see in the sky. What you see in the sky will generally be a bit different than what is actually happening in the chart. So it's more of a um, geometric, mathematical system and a seasonal system. So those are the two main systems, but it's also true that pretty much every culture in the world has some way of working with the stars, right? Every culture throughout history looked up at the sky and had their own constellations, right? The 12 tropical zodiac signs, which are based on constellations, though there is a slight difference between the two. They are based on the Greek constellations. Not every culture used those same configurations of stars in the same way, right? So there are lots of other ways of working with the stars, of working with different constellations. There's even like other cultural interpretations of the constellations that we might be most familiar with. So there's thousands of different ways to work with these tools, but the two primary systems that most people use would be the Western tropical and the Vedic sidereal. And I think they can, just those two, I think they can be complementary, but
Mhm.
they are going to contradict one another, quite literally. Like you're going to have two different astrology charts with these two different systems.
Okay.
And so I find, although I know a handful of people who use both, I find the vast majority of astrologers find a system that they prefer and that seems to resonate more with them, and that's where they will land. And of course, that does often tend to be cultural, right? The Vedic tradition comes from India. The Western tradition comes from Greece and the Arabic world and moving into Europe, but not exclusively, right? Like people can absolutely work with either system. But I find most people land in the one that just resonates most for them.
Okay. Okay. And you had mentioned because of all these different systems and now with technology that we have today, I'm going to assume, because I did a little bit of research with regards to some of the technology that's used to like develop a natal chart, etc., that those technologies, so they're different based on the system that you're leveraging, right? That's an accurate assumption. I didn't look into I looked into the Western one and the Hellenistic, but I'm going to assume that there's others that are out there that really speak to their respective form of astrology, correct?
Yes, yeah. So if you just Google like, free astrology chart, it's most of the time, most of the links that are just going to pop up are probably going to be a Western tropical Hellenistic chart.
Correct.
But if you specifically Google, free Vedic astrology chart, you'll find Vedic calculators. And I'm sure there are calculators for some of the other different cultural systems as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was really interesting to me. And so, as you kind of shared the different forms of astrology, it's across different cultures, right? And it can be different in each air depending on which one you select. The other bit that you shared, well, I don't think you shared this, but in terms of the times. So, what I mean by that is the era in which astrology was used. I'm going to say that there was a natural evolution with regards to it. Would you say that how astrology was used back in the day is very different from how we use it today?
Yeah, so both the Western and the Vedic traditions evolved, and I'm not going to quote dates because I'm going to get them wrong, but it's a very, very, very long time ago, right? We're talking thousands of years ago. They evolved at roughly the same time, like within the same, few hundred years, they both evolved alongside one another, which is interesting in and of itself. But I remember looking that up actually very recently. I was at an astrology conference and I was having a conversation with some friends and we were like, which one came first? And then we were like, oh, they apparently came about at the same time. That's really fascinating.
Okay.
Which is true of, my like personal background is my degrees in art history. And so the like anthropological art historical stuff is very interesting to me. So I love that piece of it as well. But I do think, and we can absolutely say that in both traditions, the
Mhm,
way that they were used traditionally,
mhm,
especially thousands of years ago, but even, so with Western astrology, which I can certainly speak to a lot more specifically, Western astrology was practiced really throughout history, but there was a long period where it sort of fell out of favor. It wasn't as common. like a lot of systems and tools in after the fall of the Roman Empire and moving into the Middle Ages and that period. But in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, astrology actually had a resurgence. And which is interesting because we think of the Renaissance as this time of like, moving more towards enlightenment and, focused on science, but astrology was considered a completely valid science. And so it came back and we had this resurgence. And so the more kind of ancient, very traditional way of working with astrology tends to be very fatalistic, right? It's very much like, is this person going to have a good life or not, right? Is this person, going to, it's very black and white. It's very cut and dry, right? Of like good and bad and positive and negative, right? Like there's not a lot of like personal development that's a part of it. And then it has a resurgence, in the late Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, which there's also a resurgence of interest in like alchemy and magic and things like that, systems like that, that at different points were considered valid sciences and at other points were not. But definitely that happens alongside astrology. And so I would say, like, I think that astrology gets sort of connected to some of those pieces, right? And this like concept of astrological magic becomes popular. With especially the like scholars and the like scholar monks and people like that in the late Middle Ages. And they start working with astrology as a tool. And it kind of tends towards that more fatalistic view, but it makes sense, right? Like for the historical time period, like there was so much like massive change and, epidemics and things like that were happening at that time.
Mhm.
Um, but astrology kind of like sticks around. It stays the course even after, alchemy kind of falls away and some of these other systems become less popular. Astrology really stays. And there was a very, very long period where in order to be a medical doctor, you had to study astrology, because astrology also relates to all the different parts and meridians of the body. And so astrology was really tied to science and medicine and, maybe not what we would consider science now, but nonetheless, at the time it was. And then astrology, as we then move into the actual Enlightenment period, the 1700s, moving into the 1800s, like astrology really falls off a lot more. And so there's a pretty long period where any of these tools were really looked down on, right? And that's in the period that's like post the witch trials, especially post the Salem witch trials specifically, which is like one of the last really major witch trials to take place in North America or Europe. Most of the witch trials were 100 years earlier than that. And so the Salem witch trials, which we in the States like tend to think of as like the quintessential witch trial, is actually very late, and even in its own time was considered very backward and very outdated. And so after that, there's a lot of shift, not specifically around astrology, but around anything mystical, to really move away from that and to become more science-minded, more enlightened, right? Which is unfortunately was a positive in the moving away from the witch trials, but unfortunately was very, very highly patriarchal. And so then we don't really see so much of a resurgence of like the mystical systems of astrology, of any of that, again, until somewhat in the 1800s, but really the early 1900s, we have like the spiritualist movement, which like Harry Houdini was a part of, and a lot of famous writers and creatives at the early 20th century were really interested in these systems and started to bring them back. And we also see like in the early mid 20th century, we see like the founding of Wicca, and like there's a lot of movement towards these like more mystical ideas, which is often painted, especially at the time, as like a reclamation, but is really the astrology was the case, right? The most of the astrological systems that we use today are quite ancient, but most of the mystical systems we use are loosely inspired by something ancient, but not necessarily as ancient as maybe the 20th century writers would have wanted us to believe. They were creating a lot of it themselves at the time too.
Now, when you divide it up and you say astrological versus mystical, are you trying to say that we move from it being back in that day, it being more scientific and having a more importance within our lives versus today where it is not as utilized or not as in.
No, so astrology at the time, right, when we're talking like pre-enlightenment, astrology was fully considered a science. Like it was studied at Oxford.
Okay.
Like astrology was considered a something you, like I said, like doctors needed to know, things like that, right? Now we definitely see astrology more as, well, for one thing, during the Enlightenment, right, it came to be seen as a quote unquote pseudoscience, and not a real science, right? And so there was kind of a pushback against that. And then as astrology became more popular again, right, it was really much more connected to spirituality, to intuition, to mysticism. And I think astrology can be absolutely correlated in either direction. People still practice medical astrology. There's lots of, more I don't want to say more scientific. I don't have a better word for than that, but like, more maybe structured ways of working with astrology. But I would say the more popular, the more common ways of working with astrology now are very much around psychology, around personal development, around inner work. And also a lot of the astrologers in the especially early, but even now still early 20th century, who kind of repopularized astrology and brought it back into a more mainstream consciousness, were really interested in connecting astrology with psychology specifically. So evolutionary astrology and psychological astrology. There's another term that is escaping me right now, but definitely through the self-development sphere, right? Of really like focusing on who are we, who do we want to be, who can we become versus the, very fatalistic, are you going to have a good life or a shitty one,
Right.
right? of
Right.
the ancient astrologers.
Okay. And it's interesting you said that, nowadays it's looked at in modern times, from a psychological self-development perspective. I remember as I was reading your book, and I actually took a class. I took a class, I'll tell you about that a little bit more. But as I was reading your book, I had an epiphany of sorts. I was like, is this how Myers-Briggs was developed? Because so my background is human resources. I've been in HR for over 20 years, and now I'm in technology, but prior to, I was in HR, and we did a lot of self-development. And tests prior to hiring an employee, and even during their tenure, just to ensure that they were placed in the right positions and that we were providing them the right development. And all I kept thinking was, I wonder if some of this data is leveraged from astrology, because it felt very familiar. And so it was very interesting as I was going through this. I said, I'm gonna now have to go. Too much research going on. I want to go and research that and just to see how they go through of developing that information. So that was my next question, because that's a lot of data. When I went through, I took a course by Damian McKinnon, I believe was his name, through Udemy. You can take like 100,000 courses. Like you're just like, what is this? I want to learn more about it. You could just jump online and take a course, right? So I went ahead and I was like, let me take his course because I have no idea what this is. As I mentioned to you earlier, I was like, when I was a kid, I loved astrology, but I just cracked open a newspaper and was like, ooh, what's my horoscope? Nothing to the degree in which I just learned. And I thought to myself, where did this data come from? Like how did they gather all of this to be able to put it all together? It truly is a science. Oh my goodness, this is a science. It's a very complicated science. And I was just amazed that, the way that he interwove the perspectives, looking from the house, or I'm sorry, but oh yeah, the houses, the signs, the earth, fire, water, the elements, right? And so it was just all I kept thinking, where in God's name did they get the time to get all this data? Where did that come from? What's the origin of all of that? Do you know how that was derived to be able to deliver to individuals who are interested to know about, hey, my future, what is it going to look like? What am I most prone? What do I gravitate towards, etc.? Where did it come from?
So the 12 basic zodiac signs, right? So the we can break astrology down in a few different ways, right? So we definitely break it down to the 12 signs. We can break the signs down into groups as well. So we can break them into groups of elements, and groups of modalities, which is basically like how they show up, how they operate. And all of that, including the houses as well, which are there's 12 signs, 12 houses, one sign rules each house. So they're sort of interrelated. But signs, houses, elements, modalities, all those pieces are very, very ancient, right? So all of those pieces come from the ancient Western and Vedic astrology. And they are very much tied to the planets, right? It really starts with the planets. So there's this ancient concept that was very popular in the Middle Ages in particular, when astrology first really started to come back into awareness.
Mhm.
There's this concept, and there's a great visual. If you Google, I'm trying to think what the best way to Google it would be. If you Google like medieval like diagram of the planets or of the spheres or something like that, you'll find this image. And it's like concentric circles,
Okay.
and the Earth is in the middle. And the concept is that as we go out from the Earth, there are these different spheres of consciousness or different spheres of it's also often tied to like the angelic realms. The middle ages, of course, they were relating everything back to Christianity as well, even though they were working with planets named for pagan gods. But of course it was mostly monks doing the research, so it all, they tie it back to their own thing as well. But as the idea is that as you move out from the Earth, there are these different spheres or different realms that are ruled by each of the planets. And so the moon, of course, rules the piece closest to the Earth because it's the thing literally closest to us. And then I can't recall, I can't remember if the sun comes next or if the sun is at the outer ring. I can't picture the graph closely enough in my head, but I know the moon is the closest one. And then you go out from the planets in the order that they are in our solar system, right? We have Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. And the zodiac, or not the zodiac, but the astrology would have ended there, right? They didn't know that there were more planets beyond Saturn because you can't see the outer planets with the naked eye. So until the invention of the telescope, no one knew that there were planets beyond Saturn. But Saturn would be the outermost. And then, like I said, the sun might be after that. I can't recall. And then the fixed stars are on the outside of that. The stars that, don't, the planets move, right? And you can see them move. The fixed stars do not move.
Right.
In the same way.
Okay.
And so this idea, this like medieval idea, which I can't recall if they like pulled it from an ancient source or if they came up with this idea in the Middle Ages, but the imagery is generally medieval. The idea is that there are these different spheres outside of us that are ruled by each of the planets, and each of the planets is named for, one of the mostly Roman, yes, at that time, all Roman, gods.
Mhm.
And aside from the sun and the moon, of course.
Mhm.
And they each rule over these different parts of our lives. And yes, that's tied to the information that's been gathered for thousands of years over, what does this planet seem to be connected to, or what does this zodiac sign or constellation seem to be connected to? But it's also related to its mythology, right? Mercury is the god of he's the messenger god, and Mercury is the planet of communication. Venus is, of course, the goddess of love, and she's the planet of love and desire and money and all the ways we give and receive things. And so a lot of it is tied to the mythology. And so each of these spheres, it's a great visual to understand the way the planets impact us, right? That those closest to us have the greatest impact because they're literally closest to us. Those farther away have less impact, but rule over broader ideas, broader parts of our lives. And then essentially you take astrology down from the planets, right? So each of the planets rules a particular zodiac sign, or in the case of a few of them, a few signs. Each sign rules a particular house. Each sign and house have a particular element, right? So you can really break it down quite a bit to have these instead of this like very big, broad, nebulous concept, it's like, okay, well, this sign
Mhm.
is ruled by this planet and it has this element and it has this modality
Mhm.
and this is what it rules over, right? This is what it's associated with,
Yeah.
both through, thousands of years of data, but also through the mythology that it's connected with as well.
Okay, thanks for sharing that part because I didn't put that together, which is now I understand why individuals, when you talk about astrology, I didn't realize a lot of individuals, especially in the Christian community, they would say, "Oh, this is paganistic. You're honoring something that is not permitted by God and etc." I'll be honest with you, I don't even know why. I should have put two and two together, but I don't even know why I didn't think about it like that. So do you find that like out in especially in the US because we're a very Christian based country, right? We say we're diverse, but it's heavily Christian oriented, if you will. So do you find that a lot of individuals try to, especially if you're dealing or sharing this information with Christians, I'll just say Christians, that they tend to want to stay away from it because it's paganistic in nature.
Well, my work is I work with witches and pagans, so no. But in general, yes, I mean, there's definitely astrology is not inherently it's not inherently witchy. There's lots of people who work with astrology who don't necessarily practice magic the way that I do, but I do think astrology is inherently, not necessarily inherently pagan in that you have to be working with the gods themselves, right, in order to be practicing it. But I do think that to me, to practice astrology and, sort of try to disconnect it from the mythology and try to disconnect it from that ancient source that it comes from, right? I mean, because it is primarily Hellenistic, right, which is
Mhm.
Greek. So the Greek gods, of course, predate the Roman gods, but they're all sort of somewhat interchangeable, right? Venus and Aphrodite are associated, Mars and Aries are associated, etc. Um, and so the Hellenistic astrologers, when they were creating it, of course, they were practicing their own religion, which was not pagan, right? It was just their religion. There was no such thing as Christianity at the time. And so, yeah, I think that it is important to, I definitely don't think you have to be pagan to work with astrology, but I do think that it's important to understand its roots and to honor those roots rather than, I don't know. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with practicing astrology and being Christian, but I do think there's something wrong with, sort of dismissing or trying to disconnect it from that source.
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean I didn't put that together at all. And probably because I don't really recall what I learned in history as it relates to Greek and the Hellenistic period. But that it's helpful, I think, to have that background, especially as I was going through. And I kid you not, I was sitting here like, now, how did they put Saturn with this ideology and things of that nature? But now that you helped to pull that together for me because I all I kept thinking about was where this data was coming from. So it's actually I would encourage astrologers and individuals such as yourself to give that historical component because it helps to enrich the experience even further from my perspective. Because that piece, all I kept saying was, where in God's name is all it is coming from? um,
Very, very ancient ideas.
very ideas. Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a high level overview. So I did the natal chart and I was really intrigued because when you get the imagery back, it's very overwhelming. And so I was looking at it and I was like, okay, oh, okay. So my sun sign, I'm Sagittarius. My birthday is November 23rd. And I was like, okay, I'm Sagittarius. Okay, great. My sign exists in the 11th house. My ascendant sign was Capricorn. And I was like, oh, that's my sister. My sister is Capricorn. Her sun sign is Capricorn, but mine is Sagittarius. And so I was like, Oh, so, because they say your ascendant sign helps you to understand how you show up in the world, right? And so I was like, oh, which is actually kind of true. I do show up like a Capricorn because I used to say I do like I'm adventurous. I like, I'm very philosophical. I do like to do a lot of research and be out in the world to understand how the world works, etc. I said, but I'm very structured. I'm very about business, etc. I said, oh, that was pretty interesting because that is true. And then I went into, and it said my descendant sign was Cancer. I can't say that I too much correlate there, but I don't believe I have a good grasp of descendant signs, etc. I'm still learning, if you will, right?
Yeah.
But it's good to understand because I was trying to understand um, my sun sign, my moon, the moon, and there was a third one what was the other one? Moon, sun, and when you look at your natal chart to see all of the different positionings of the
So
planet.
the sun, moon, and ascendant are considered kind of like the big three, the
Yes,
main
the
three.
big three.
But you have all of the planets in your chart. And that is like the way you described it of like the difference between your sun and your ascendant is exactly it, right? That
Mhm.
when we look at just our sun sign, which is the sign that like you know off the top of your head, right? That most people know their sign, even if they know nothing else about astrology, right? You
Right.
know your and that's your sun sign. But it is a very authentic part of who you are. Like it's generally you think of the sun as like what makes you happy, right? It's like your happy place, the things that just like really bring you a lot of joy, but it's just one part of your chart, right? You have all of the planets in your chart.
Yeah.
And yeah, just one of many. And all of the different planets tell you something about how you operate in a particular part of your life, right? How you communicate, how you show up in relationships, how you what your work life is like, right? How you are in all these different parts of yourself. And so the big three, the three main signs to know are your sun, moon, and ascendant, which is also called the rising sign.
Mhm.
And so the sun is your joy. The moon is like the innermost self, right? It's your emotions, your intuition. And the moon is, I usually find like the moon makes a lot of sense to you, but it doesn't make sense to other people who don't know you very well, right? Like your partner, your best friend will be like, oh yeah, that's totally you. But people who don't know you so well won't see it in you because it's very private. And then the ascendant or the rising sign is like you said, exactly the outermost self, right? It's how you show up in the world. It's like the part of you that people meet first,
Mhm.
right? When you first are introduced to someone, you're working with someone, like they see your ascendant. That's the part of you that is just kind of like on the surface. It's still an authentic part of you, but it's not this really intimate personal part. But then even beyond the big three, you still have all of the other planets that tell you about these like different parts of your life. So I like to think of like the big three signs are how you show up in every part of your life, right? That's like your core essence. And then the rest of the planets help you understand, your relationship with money or your relationship with spirituality or whatever.
Yes, yes. And it's really intriguing. And I don't know if a lot of individuals have that understanding because I sure didn't.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my goodness, what is all of this? And it was actually very helpful. But at the same time, because I'll be honest with you, I was like, oh, I want to share my chart with you when I first did it, right? So this is me. I'm very I'm like, I want to share my chart with Tenae and etc. But then I got scared, and I'm going to tell you why I got scared. Okay, so I work in information technology, right? And as an information security specialist, I manage security for families, and I see on a daily basis people's identities getting stolen, etc. Right? And I will tell you, I was like, oh my goodness, I want to share it, but should I? And I say that because of how our day and age is, right? Individuals like hacking as a profession, stealing people's information is a profession in many countries, and it's an ethical one. Maybe not in the US, but around the globe, it's an ethical one. I mean, yeah, it's an ethical one. And so I wanted to have an understanding from your perspective and your experience. Have you ever thought about that? Do you ever feel like, individuals that share this type of data, that there might be some sort of ethical or security concern with sharing your astrological blueprint?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in general, I would say, so there's like on the more like spiritual, energetic side, there are people who would say never put your chart online. I think that's bullshit. Like, if you want to share your chart, share your chart. Like, it's fine. On the security side, though, I think is like a really valid question. I mean, it's a valid question on the energetic side. I just think like
Mhm.
if you're online, you're already putting your energy out there and like it's on you to have energetic boundaries, right? Like and showing your face is more personal than showing your chart. So, but on the actual security side, in general, if you put up a chart, I think it's always a good idea to crop out your personal information, right? So usually when they're, whatever calculator you use, it'll generate like an image,
Mhm.
like a ping file of your chart, right? And usually it has, your name or whatever you put in and the birth date and the time and the city you were born in, all that information, right? That the chart is generated based on.
Mhm.
So usually like, and I don't do this very often, but there are lots of astrologers who will like, you put up a chart as an example and say, hey, this is what's going on here, and so if you're going to do that or you're wanting to share your own, I think it's a good idea, like just at the baseline security, right? To just crop out your personal information.
Mhm.
But even with that said, like we all know the reality is if you Google yourself, your birthday pops up. Like the city you were born in
Sure.
pops up. Like no one has to work real hard to get that
Not
information.
at
So like it's not a bad idea to crop it, but it also probably doesn't really matter too much.
all.
Um, then I will say, like, if you are really concerned about it, like the reality is that someone who knows what they're doing with astrology, but even the chart without the data, the information, you can get pretty close to figuring out the birth date and the time
Mhm.
based on just looking at the chart itself. It would take a little work. So like to be fair, like even just putting the chart itself out is there is personal information. You could figure out something about that person. But yeah, I think Google is probably going to get you to that person's information a lot quicker. So
This is true. And so when I was thinking about this, I was like, she's in astrology, and I wonder if there is ever a conversation that have with the individuals that you engage with, just to caution them with regards to that. I follow this comedian. Her name is Holly. I can't remember what her last name is, but I think she's from the UK. But she does all of these like little, one man skits. And one of the skits she had was of some guy coming to, woo her over. And I just thought to myself, oh my God, what is this individual? Because if whether you're a spy or a thief or something to that effect, they could leverage this information to understand, what you gravitate towards, right? And leverage it to become close with you. And so, I just kept saying to myself, and even because I wanted to do my kids too, but then I was like, I'm not doing my kids because I just don't want, I didn't want them to lean on astrology like that without giving them some sort of disclaimer, if you will, right? And so I just wanted to, if you ever encountered anyone who kind of have misused it, and how do you, approach this responsibly?
yeah, it's a great question. So I definitely think like with any tool, right? Like you brought up Myers-Briggs as a good example, or people like the Enneagram, or there's so many different ways that you can like, know what your personality is. We all love a personality test, right? And essentially, although astrology is a much more complex one, it's essentially a personality test, right? When you come down to its most essential format.
Mhm.
And I think that any of these tools, like we can definitely overly rely on them. And I think we can really give our power away to them, right? Like, and I think there's two main ways that people do that. One is being like, well, like this is the thing in my chart, right? And that's why I am this way. And then like not doing anything about it, right? Like if they have a shadow or they're expressing something in an unhealthy way and they're just like, well, that's just how it is. That's how I am. That's what's in my chart, right? Or that's my Myers-Briggs or that's my such and such, right? And I think like that is definitely a thing. And I think it's a very human thing in a lot of ways, right? We don't want to work on ourselves and we don't want to work on ourselves all the time. Like we want some grace sometimes to just not be our best self.
Right.
And I think that yes, it can absolutely be kind of misused in that way. And I think it's okay to do that once in a while, but like we want to take responsibility outside of our charts, you know.
Right.
The other way that I think people misuse it is around the transits. So the transits is like another layer of astrology. So your chart is the, you know, map, the blueprint, the snapshot of the planets at the moment that you were born. It's static, it never changes, although you can express different parts of your chart at different parts of your life, right?
Right.
So it's not like you are this static, stuck person. It's just the chart itself doesn't change.
Right.
But while your chart doesn't change, all of the planets and the sun and the moon and everything is constantly in motion, right? And so throughout the month, throughout the year, throughout the decade, the different planets activate different parts of your chart.
Mm-hmm.
And each planet, you know, moves forward into new signs. We have planets that are retrograde. Like we have all of these different things. All those different terms are collectively what we call the transits.
Okay.
And the transits, I think, get misused a lot and really used in a very disempowered or disempowering way. Which is when you'll hear, and like this year is a great example. So this year is a very chaotic astrological year. In 2025, we basically have all of the planets moving forward into new signs, which is very unusual. Like some of the planets spend many, many years in each sign, so it's unusual for them all to be changing at the same time.
Mm.
And some of these planets, the signs they're moving into, historically, very big, in some cases, scary events have happened while those planets have been in those signs. So like we have Pluto in Aquarius now, which Pluto was in Aquarius during the American and French Revolutions. We have Uranus in Gemini, which Uranus was in Gemini during World War II. So there's like really big stuff happening astrologically this year. And that can be really powerful information to have, right? Like, I think we all feel like it's been a very chaotic year, definitely collectively, but even personally for a lot of us, right? There's been a lot of just like things shifting. It feels like we're stepping into this new period. We don't know what it's going to be like, right? Like, collectively, that's an energy that's really present and is really reflected in the transits. But it's very easy to talk about those like big shifts and scary, you know, historical events, right? In a really disempowered way to be like, well, Uranus is in moving into Gemini, so I guess everything's going to be terrible, right? And I think that like that's not at all what Uranus and Gemini means. It's just like, yeah, we have some historical evidence that this could be a really chaotic time. But
Okay.
like, hello, look outside. I think we could say that without knowing the astrology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the transits is a big way where astrology can be used in a very fearful way, right? To say like, well, if this transit is happening, right? And it can happen personally too, because the planets activate as they move through the signs, they activate different parts of your own chart. And some of the different parts of your chart are, you know, less happy, less joyful than others, right? Because they represent the whole fullness of our lives and of who we are. And so if you're having a, you know, deeper transit, a more emotional transit, a scarier transit, right? And you're perceiving it that way, I think that people can really show up in a way that sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the thing is that the transits don't cause like the planets moving into signs, the planets going retrograde, any of those kinds of things, right? They don't cause anything. They don't, there's no cause and effect. They're just reflecting what's going on in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's really important that we name that and we be really intentional in the way we work with astrology to say like, hey, this is not, I'm not at the mercy of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, you know, giving my power over to this thing in my chart that's not ideal. Like I have free will. I have the power to decide like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? How am I going to react? You know, how am I going to show up? And yeah, sometimes the transits reflect big scary things, and I have some examples of that in my life. There's definitely historical examples.
Mm-hmm.
But one, they didn't cause it, right? And two, it's I think just a matter of being really intentional and like taking a lot of personal responsibility that like even if something scary does happen, whatever that means, right? Whatever that looks
Mm-hmm.
like I still get to choose how I'm going to show up and how I'm going to react to that thing.
I love that you said that. That was beautiful. Beautiful. You said it so perfectly. Because I think that is one of the biggest misuses of astrology. And you saying that is going to be very helpful to many individuals as they leverage this information, because I think it is important to know that we have the capability to control our destiny. We truly do. And because our mind is a very powerful thing, and the information in which we gather is just a point of reference to help us with regards to managing, navigating, etc. within our lives. But, we don't have to lean on in a way where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I love that you said that. You were so spot on. Thank you so much for saying that, because that really is going to help a lot of people be able to use this a little bit more effectively. Um, and so we talked about, or you talked about the transit. I haven't gotten that far, girl. I don't even know what you said, retrograde. I hear it. I've heard about it, but I would tell you I've been completely ignorant. I'm like, what are they talking about? Mercury's in retrograde, and completely ignorant. Didn't even research it until now. Until now, but I'm not that far along yet. I think that's part two, if you will, more advanced studies. But I look forward to learning a little bit more about that. Um, and speaking of that, so let's talk a little bit about, because we're leveraging the signs, we're leveraging the planets, all of these different pieces. One of the things that I also read within your book is that you also leverage tarot cards. So outside of astrology, you also use tarot cards as guidance. And I wanted to understand, do you find that astrology also enhances, or I should say, when you use tarot cards, do you find that astrology also enhances your intuitive abilities in a similar way?
Yeah. So I think there's two main ways to work with astrology on the intuitive side. One is astrology can help you understand any part of yourself or any way that you show up, including your intuition. In fact, that's a way I've worked with a lot of my clients through their astrology chart to like understand how their intuition works, because most of us are pretty disconnected from our intuition, right? Our society really tells us really not to trust our intuition, right? Our society tells us we need to outsource our decisions, and there's always someone who knows better than us. And oh,
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways that that happens. And so reconnecting with our intuition is really, really powerful. And it can feel really daunting, right? Because we have all of these shadows and all this conditioning that can come up around actually really trusting ourselves,
Mhm.
especially when our intuition is telling us to like do something that other people think we shouldn't, or when our intuition is telling us to do something unconventional, right? To break the rules in some way. And so like being able to really trust yourself, especially in those moments, can be really challenging. And so your astrology chart, there are specific parts of your chart that can help you understand how your intuition works, right? Like what it feels like in your body, what it sounds like, what it feels like when you're trusting yourself, right? And so some of the main like intuition codes in the chart, the biggest one is your moon. So your moon sign is your emotional self, it's your intuition, it's like your inner landscape. And so really working with your moon sign and the house that your moon is in can be really, really powerful. And that's actually the very first type of astrology that I ever really practiced, was working with moon signs. I think it's so powerful because it really helps you understand like your most intimate inner self, right? The part of you that not everybody gets to see, the part of you that's really not just authentic, because everything in your chart is authentic, but that's like a deeper level, a deeper layer of authenticity. And so working with your moon can really help with that. But there are a few other parts of the chart as well to get a little bit more advanced. So the sign that you have in the 12th house, and if you have planets in the 12th house, is very much about your intuition. You can look at the house that you have Neptune in, although that's a little bit less personal because Neptune moves very, very slowly. So everyone born within like 15 years of you has Neptune in the same sign. But the house that you have Neptune is more specific to you. So there's a few different parts of the chart that you can kind of put together to understand like, who am I as an intuitive person, right? When I'm trusting my intuition, what does that actually look like? So that's one way that astrology can be really helpful around intuition. The other way is I find that as much as you're absolutely right, astrology is a science in terms of the sheer amount of data and math that we do on a daily basis as astrologers. But it's also very much an intuitive practice, right? And so for me, like the way that I read a chart when I don't do a lot of readings, but when I'm doing a reading or if I'm working with a one-on-one client and I bring up their chart, sometimes we're focused on a topic, right? Like we're going to look at the intuitive parts of their chart or we're looking at their relationships or whatever, right? Sometimes we're looking for something specific. But a lot of times I read a chart very intuitively. And so, maybe I'll start somewhere. I'll start with their moon, but I end up over here talking about this other thing that I just intuitively feel is important, right? I feel is coming through, right? And I always really recommend with my clients, with my astrology students, like, yes, learn the basics, learn the tools and the systems, of astrology. But when you're looking at especially when you're first starting out and you're looking at your own chart,
Mhm.
you're never going to know all the things about your chart, first of all.
Mhm.
Like, been an astrologer for a decade. You're never going to know all the things, I promise. But also, you can't study the whole chart all at the same time, right? Like it's just not physically possible. And so, yeah, you can take it, okay, I'm going to learn about this planet and then this one and then this one, or you can, go around the houses 1 through 12, go in order. You could do that. But I find it's really powerful to like dive in and do the research and work with the parts of your chart that you feel intuitively called to.
Mhm.
And, people will get these like little intuitive nudges, they're looking at their chart and they're like, I don't know, what's Mars about, right? And they start digging into their Mars and they start learning about the sign it's in and the house it's in and the aspects, the relationships it's making to other planets. And all of a sudden they're realizing like, oh my God, this is exactly what I needed right now. This is exactly what I needed to hear or the thing I needed to work on about myself or the thing I've been trying to figure out, right? And so I think that working with your chart intuitively in that way and just like seeing where the chart takes you can be really powerful because like I said, the chart is static. It does not change. It's the same throughout your life.
Okay.
And yet I've had so many clients especially clients who've worked with their chart for a long time, be like, I never noticed this thing in my chart before, but it jumped out at me the other day
Mhm.
and it was exactly what I needed to see.
Okay. Oh, that's very, very helpful because and you answered one of my questions because I was going to say, so I'm at this point in my life, is my chart going to change? So that's a good plus because I was like, this is going to take me about 10 years to understand more, right? But I appreciate that because I it's very complex. And I will say, when you mention the fact that we should use our intuitive nature, you are you are so correct because of all of the different bodies of people, groups, organizations, etc., that have an impact on our lives. We have become less of an intuitive species, if you will. And I appreciate when I was looking at my own personal chart, I was gravitating towards certain houses, towards certain signs, and really just trying to understand it all. And I will say that I felt drawn, like something was pulling me. Oh, look here. Oh, look there. And that is very critical that individuals do that because it might be something that's relevant and going to be helpful for you at a point in time. Right. And I think, and it was because I was like, these are certain things in which I'm going through right now. And it's interesting that I was pulled to all of these different places, like just yesterday, actually. But really, really interesting. So thanks for sharing your level of insight. And now the other bit that I wanted to highlight was, so we're using our intuition. We're leveraging divination tools, or you're leveraging, because I don't even know about tarot. That's going to be another conversation for another day. Definitely have to bring you back because this is just also very intriguing to me. Um, But what about just in general within society? And I bring that up because personally, so I've never, as I mentioned, I never used astrology to kind of figure out my life, but I do use the world, right? And I feel like I have this relationship with the energies in the world. And I notice, these synchronicities and leveraging my dreams, the environment, etc. I find these in my daily life to be helpful in terms of taking my next step or making a decision, etc. Do you find that in your space outside of using astrology, outside of using tarot cards, that you also leverage just these, I don't even know, average everyday skills that we naturally possess?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that although, astrology and tarot and oracle cards, and there's lots of tools we can use, right, that are like specifically intended for this purpose, but
Mhm.
I don't think we need them. Like, I don't think that any of those tools I definitely don't think they're required or necessary to connect with your intuition, right? Like, you're absolutely so, so right that like we have so much information around us that's guiding us
Mhm.
all the time, right? Whether you're asking a specific tool or not, and actually paying attention to those things can be sometimes even more powerful than, astrology is a little bit different, but I mean, honestly, even astrology, because like if you pull a tarot card or you look at, what's being activated in your chart, what your transits are, right? Whatever you're looking at, that information can be so powerful and so helpful,
Mhm.
but it's also something that's like filtered, right? It's like a middleman, right? It's like the information, the insight is being filtered through your tarot cards or your astrology chart. And sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes it's useful to like take a step back and have something outside of yourself, that's like reflecting something to you. But we don't need it. Like, you can tune into your intuition with absolutely anything, right? You can sit down in the grass and close your eyes and just listen to yourself and know what to do next.
Right.
And I think that we all have different words for it, right? This is one of those things that like really transcends spiritualities and faiths and cultures, right? Where it's like we all experience that. Like, we all have the ability to notice a synchronicity and then be like, oh my God, I just had the perfect idea. I know exactly what to do, right? Or you wake up from a dream and you're like, oh, like that was a really weird dream, but it just made me think of this thing, like we all have that and we call it different things, right? You might call it the universe, or you might call it your higher self, or you might call it God, or you might call it your ancestors, or like you might call it lots of different things. But ultimately it's the same like, you know, primordial stuff, right? That's like we all have a connection to something bigger than ourselves, something greater,
Mhm.
and we can all tap into it and we can use tools to access it, but we definitely don't need them.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was reading your book, and I thought to myself, because I've never leveraged tools before, but I thought, well, one way or one idea that came to my mind was these are great resources to help in tapping into my intuitive self a little bit more effectively, especially if I'm struggling and it's hard to make a decision. Perhaps I can leverage divination tools, and not in a very mystical manner, but just how I do in my daily life, whether it's sitting on the floor, meditating, or when I wake up in the morning and thoughts just begin to enter my mind with regards to what needs to be done and how I'm going to do that. And then I get a spark of light or geniusness that just comes out. Um, but I thought this would help someone who found it very difficult in order to tap into their intuitive self most effectively. So it's great that we do have these additional resources. So let me ask you this. For someone who's newly curious about astrology, but just really unsure where to start, what would you recommend as a beginner's path? Are there resources, courses, practices that you personally recommend that are both accurate and respectful of the tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always recommend people start working with their own chart, right? So people always want to, just like you said, right? Like I want to pull my kids' charts, I want to pull my partner's chart, like I want to pull my best friend's chart. And that's really fun to do. And it can be a great thing to do, but start with your own chart, right? Because there's so much there. And people always want to like interpret their friends and family's charts. And I think until you feel really grounded in your chart, like you don't want to start digging too much into other people's charts because when you start to work with like your moon sign, for example, right, you see how much it's this really personal inner thing that someone else might really not get about you. And so I really recommend starting with your own chart and like go deep with that. Like spend some time with your own chart because there's so much there that's going to actually help you get really grounded in the like what all of these parts and pieces even are, right? Because you're going to see them in your own life.
Mm.
So work with your own chart. There are some great free apps and things out there. I really recommend the Chani app, which is a free app on Android and Apple. That I think there's lots of astrology apps. A lot of them are bad. Okay. Chani is good. Chani is really, really good.
Thank you for that.
Um, so there's a lot of them I do not recommend. That one I highly recommend. And that's a great place to start, getting to know your chart. It has great horoscopes and resources and things. And then yeah, I have my podcast where I've done a couple of episodes on like astrology 101, kind of breaking down some of the things you need to know, which is the Empowered Modern Witches Show, my podcast.
Okay.
And then I have two places. I have a course and a membership as well where I teach all about astrology.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. I'm sorry. I think I cut you off. What did you say your podcast, the name of it is?
The podcast is the Empowered Modern Witches Show.
Empowered Modern Witches Show. Okay, fantastic. And then you also stated you have a couple courses that you offer. And
Yeah, I have a course, which is the Celestial Alchemy Astrology course. That's my method that I teach. So that's the like, if you want to go super deep, learn all the things, like I walk you from the very beginning all the way through
Mhm.
with your chart. And then I also have a membership, the Starlight Library, where I don't only teach on astrology, but there's like sort of like a mini course inside the membership that kind of gives you some of the astrology basics. And then most of our workshops, there's a library of over 100 workshops and rituals and things that we've done in there, and then we add new things to it every month. But most of the workshops we are looking to your astrology chart in one way or another.
Okay, okay, fantastic. Well, that is wonderful, wonderful news, wonderful resources in which we can tap into. I know I definitely am going to be connecting with you again because it was just very interesting to go through my own chart and try to have a solid understanding. Once I got a grasp of all the different signs and trying to memorize everything, it's complicated. So it's always helpful to know that we have a guru on hand who can assist us with better understanding that. Emily, Lord, excuse me. Tanae, was there anything else in which you would like to share with us as it relates to astrology or even with regards to your book?
Yeah. So the book we've mostly been talking about is my first book, The Modern Witch's Guide to Magical Self-Care, where, like you said, like we sort of talk about like how to create your own practices, right? And astrology is a piece of that. I will say though, my favorite of my books, which I probably shouldn't tell them I have favorites, but my favorite of my books is my second book, The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic. And it's actually, I think, a great way to learn astrology, which is it's not exactly the intention of the book, but in practice, I think that it's really helpful for that. And the idea of the natural magic book is that it walks you through the 12 signs of the zodiac through the season. So like I said at the beginning, right, Western astrology is very seasonal. And so it walks you through the four seasons and the three zodiac signs in each season, and what those are all about. It relates it back to the moon phases as well. And the book is called Natural Magic because there's a recipe for each of the zodiac signs and the new and full moons throughout the year. So there's tea recipes and oil recipes and things like that. And so it's a really great way to like really get more grounded. Astrology can be so abstract and so much information. And I find that like working with plants, working with the seasons, can really help you bring a lot of that like more down to earth and get more grounded in it. So that's one of my favorite ways that I've taught astrology in that book.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for providing that resource. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I'll have to go and check that out as well. All right, Tenae. Well, it definitely was such a pleasure to get to chat with you, get to learn a little bit more about you, astrology, and your new resources. I didn't even know you had a library. I don't know. Is that on your website? Did you say it was on your website?
The library is on my website.
On your
The
website.
course, I have a link. I need to add it. The course I teach as a certification,
Okay.
but we're also adding just a like a self-paced course as well. So that will be up soon.
Okay, okay, fantastic. Yeah, definitely want to thank you for all those lovely resources. And I hope that this is not the last time that I get to connect with you and learn a little bit more about who you are and what you do. Thank you so much for joining us here on Proactive is the Way. What a beautiful way to close out our summer series, exploring personal care through a magical, mystical lens with the incredible Tenae Stewart. If this conversation stirred something in you, I encourage you to pick up her book, The Modern Witch's Guide to Magickal Self-Care, and dive even deeper. It's a powerful resource for anyone looking to create rituals that nourish the body, mind, and soul. Now, as we shift seasons, we're also shifting focus. In 2 weeks, we'll begin a brand new series as part of my Glow Up. And this time, we are getting real about money. Because here's the truth. It's one thing to have your mindset aligned and your health in check. But if you're constantly in financial survival mode, it's hard to fully thrive. I grew up with mixed messages about money, from just get a good job to money is the root of all evil. But I've come to realize that understanding money isn't just about numbers. It's about beliefs, behaviors, and patterns that keep us stuck. To help guide this journey, I'll be reading The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. This powerful book explores how emotion, history, and mindset influence our financial choices and what it really takes to create lasting change. To prepare, grab your copy of The Psychology of Money. Details are in the episode description. And don't forget to visit www.kinkyknotscafe.com to catch up on all past episodes and learn more about our community. Until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and remember, proactive is the way, my friends. Take good care.